To the world, Lucille Ball was unstoppable. With her fiery red hair, wide-eyed expressions, and impeccable comedic timing, she became one of the most beloved entertainers in American history. But behind the laughter and the applause was a woman who carried private struggles and a fierce determination never to let her audience see weakness. To understand why Lucille Ball hid her illness from fans, we must first journey back to the beginning, to the girl who learned very early that survival meant smiling, even when life was breaking her heart. Lucille Ball was born on August 6, 1911, in Jamestown, New York. Her early childhood was marked by instability and hardship. Her father, Ball, died when she was only 3 years old, leaving the family in emotional and financial turmoil. Her mother, Desiree, struggled to support the family while raising Lucille and her younger brother. Money was scarce, and the family was forced to move frequently, often depending on relatives for shelter. These early years of uncertainty taught Lucille resilience. She learned quickly that if she wanted security, she would have to fight for it herself. Even as a child, Lucille found escape in humor and performance. She loved to entertain her classmates and neighbors, often putting on small shows in her backyard. While the world around her felt unpredictable, laughter gave her control. She once said, "I'd rather regret the things I have done than the things I have not." This philosophy became the foundation of her daring career. Yet, in these early years, she also developed a habit that would follow her throughout life, hiding her pain behind humor. As a teenager, Lucille set her sights on New York City, determined to become an actress. She enrolled in drama school, but the road was anything but easy. Her teachers at the John Murray Anderson School for the Dramatic Arts were not impressed. One of her instructors even told her she had no future in acting. For many, that would have been the end of the dream. But not for Lucille. She returned home, worked a series of odd jobs, and saved money to try again. This persistence was the hallmark of her character. She refused to show weakness, even when others doubted her. In the 1930s, Lucille moved to Hollywood, hoping to break into films. She started as a model and chorus girl before landing small roles in movies. At first, she was typecast as a pretty face, the glamorous extra in the background. But Lucille was never satisfied with being just another face in the crowd. She wanted more. Over the years, she worked tirelessly, learning from every role, no matter how small. She became known as the Queen of the B-movies, appearing in over 60 films during the 1930s and 40s. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her the training ground she needed. What set Lucille apart was her ability to laugh at herself. Unlike many glamorous Hollywood actresses, she embraced physical comedy, falling, tripping, making exaggerated expressions. She was willing to look ridiculous if it meant making people laugh. This self-deprecating humor made her relatable and unforgettable. But behind that willingness to play the fool was a deeply ambitious woman who wanted control of her own destiny. She understood that laughter could be both a weapon and a shield. It could win over an audience, but it could also protect her from showing her vulnerabilities. In 1940, while filming Too Many Girls, Lucille met D.C. Arnaz, a Cuban-born musician and actor. Their chemistry was undeniable, and they married later that year. Their relationship was fiery, passionate, and often turbulent, but it would also lead to the creation of one of the most iconic shows in television history. Together, they became not just a couple, but a brand. To the public, Lucille and Desi were the perfect pair, glamorous, funny, and full of charm. What fans didn't see was the struggle behind the scenes, the arguments, the betrayals, and Lucille's determination to keep her private pain hidden from the public eye. In 1951, Lucille and Desi launched I Love Lucy. At first, television executives doubted the idea. They didn't think audiences would accept a show about a red-headed American housewife married to a Cuban bandleader. But Lucille fought for it, insisting that Desi play her husband on screen. The show became a cultural phenomenon, revolutionizing television and cementing Lucille Ball as a household name. Week after week, millions tuned in to watch her comedic brilliance. What they saw was a woman full of energy and life, What they didn't see were the growing pressures on her health and marriage. As Lucille's fame skyrocketed, so did her responsibility. She was not just the star of I Love Lucy, she was also a producer and businesswoman, running Desilu Productions with Desi Arnaz. She worked tirelessly, often to the point of exhaustion. But no matter how she felt, she appeared on camera with a smile, ready to perform. From the very beginning, Lucille made a choice. The public would only see her strength, never her weakness. This decision, born in childhood and reinforced by fame, would later influence her decision to hide her illness. By the mid-1950s, Lucille Ball was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. She had transformed herself from a struggling actress into the queen of television. But beneath the laughter and the bright lights, Lucille was already building the walls that would later keep her private struggles hidden. She knew that her audience depended on her for joy, and she refused to let them see anything else. This was the beginning of a double life. One lived in front of the camera, and one carried quietly in the shadows. In part 2, we'll explore the height of her fame, the pressures that came with it, and the habits that began to affect her health long before the world ever knew she was sick. Lucille Ball's rise to stardom wasn't just a stroke of luck. By the early 1950s, she had already proven herself as one of the most hardworking and determined women in Hollywood. But what would truly cement her legacy was a little television show that would change the world. I Love Lucy. When I Love Lucy premiered in 1951, no one could have predicted the cultural impact it would have. At the time, television was still in its infancy. Radio and film were the dominant forces of entertainment. But Lucy and her team managed to capture lightning in a bottle. The show wasn't just funny, it was revolutionary. Lucille insisted that her real-life husband, Desi Arnaz, play her on-screen husband. Despite resistance from network executives, many doubted that American audiences would accept a Cuban man married to an American woman on primetime TV. But Lucille fought for Desi. She knew his talent, his charisma, and their undeniable chemistry would shine through. And she was right. Week after week, audiences tuned in to see Lucy Ricardo's hilarious misadventures. From the famous chocolate factory scene to her attempts at show business, Lucy's physical comedy was unmatched. She had a gift for timing, facial expressions, and turning even the simplest scenario into uncontrollable laughter. But what most people didn't see was the pressure behind the laughter. Each episode required enormous effort. The physical gags took a toll on her body. Long hours, rehearsals, and the stress of maintaining such a demanding pace began to wear her down. Yet Lucille never let it show. She believed that her audience deserved the very best version of her, smiling, full of energy, and seemingly unstoppable. Privately, though, cracks were beginning to show. Lucille was a lifelong smoker. She started smoking as a teenager, long before the dangers of cigarettes were widely known. By the time she was filming I Love Lucy, she was often seen with a cigarette between takes. It was part of the culture of Hollywood at the time, but for Lucille, it became an addiction she never truly broke. The stress of her marriage also added to her struggles. While audiences adored Lucy and Desi on screen, their real-life relationship was much more complicated. Desi's infidelity and drinking habits created tension at home. Lucille filed for divorce more than once, though they often reconciled, until finally parting ways for good in 1960. Even then, their love for each other never fully disappeared, but the emotional toll left lasting scars. Despite personal difficulties, Lucille kept pushing forward. She wasn't just an actress. She became a trailblazer in the television industry. With Desi, she co-founded Desilu Productions, which produced hit shows like Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Lucille wasn't just the star of I Love Lucy. She was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, breaking barriers in an industry dominated by men. But power and fame came at a cost. Lucille was known for her perfectionism. She demanded excellence from herself and everyone around her. That drive kept her at the top, but it also left her exhausted. By the late 1960s and 1970s, Lucille was still working, starring in new shows like The Lucy Show and Here's Lucy. While they never reached the monumental success of I Love Lucy, They kept her in the public eye. And still, fans never suspected that she was beginning to suffer physically. Friends and colleagues noticed that Lucille often appeared tired, sometimes short of breath, but she brushed it off with jokes or simply ignored it. She would say things like, "I've been doing this too long to stop now." Her entire identity was tied to being strong, funny, and unstoppable. The truth was, Lucille Ball had always been deeply aware of her audience. She believed that millions of fans turned to her for joy, laughter, and escape from their own troubles. To let them see her weak, vulnerable, or sick would be, in her mind, a betrayal of what she stood for. So, even as her health slowly declined, Lucille hid it behind a wall of humor, makeup, and determination. She didn't want pity. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted to be remembered as the fiery redhead who made America laugh, not as a woman struggling with illness. By the late 1970s, whispers began to circulate in Hollywood. Some noticed she wasn't as vibrant as she used to be. Others speculated about her health, but Lucille herself always denied anything was wrong. She attended events, made television appearances, and continued performing, determined to maintain her legendary image. In reality, decades of smoking had begun to wreak havoc on her body. Her lungs and heart were under strain. Doctors warned her to slow down, but Lucille, ever the performer, pushed the concerns aside. To her, stepping back meant admitting defeat, and that was something she simply couldn't do. Lucille Ball was many things: a comedian, a producer, a pioneer, and a symbol of resilience. But she was also human. Behind the laughter and the spotlight, she carried pain, disappointment, and a growing illness that she was determined to keep hidden. By this time, she wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting her fans. She knew millions looked up to her as a symbol of joy, and she believed that as long as she kept smiling, they would too. What Lucille didn't realize, however, was that hiding her illness would only make her final years more mysterious and heartbreaking. Because when the truth finally came out, the world was shocked. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, Lucille Ball remained a towering figure in Hollywood. Even though I Love Lucy had ended decades earlier, reruns kept her image alive in millions of living rooms across America. Younger generations were discovering her for the first time, while older fans clung to her as a cherished reminder of simpler times. For Lucille, this was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, she was proud that her work had stood the test of time. On the other, it meant she could never escape the expectation of always being Lucy, funny, energetic, and larger than life. By now, her body was beginning to fail her. Years of heavy smoking had left her with significant lung damage, and doctors had quietly warned her about the long-term risks. She often experienced shortness of breath, coughing, and fatigue. Her heart was also under strain. But Lucille had mastered the art of hiding pain. She used makeup, witty remarks, and sheer willpower to push through. When asked in interviews how she managed to keep going, she would brush it off with humor. "Well, I can't let the audience down, can I?" To her, laughter was medicine, not just for fans, but for herself. During this time, Lucille made public appearances that showed flashes of her old brilliance. But to those who looked closely, the difference was obvious. She moved more slowly, her voice sometimes raspier, her once boundless energy tempered by age and illness. Still, she refused to admit weakness. In 1985, Lucille made one of her last major television appearances on the Academy Awards, alongside her friend Bob Hope. To the audience, it was a heartwarming reunion of two comedy legends. But behind the scenes, Lucille was struggling. She had insisted on appearing despite doctors' concerns, determined not to disappoint fans. On stage, she smiled and joked as always, but afterward, she was visibly drained. Why was she so determined to keep going? The answer lay deep within her personality. Lucille Ball grew up in an era when showing vulnerability was often seen as weakness. Her childhood was filled with hardship, and from a young age, she learned to survive by putting on a brave face. Comedy wasn't just her career, it was her shield. To reveal her illness to the world would mean exposing herself in a way she had spent her whole life avoiding. Another factor was her relationship with her audience. For decades, Lucille believed she had a responsibility to the American public. She once said that people watched I Love Lucy to escape their own struggles, to forget about bills, wars, and personal troubles, if only for a half hour. To let them see her sick, frail, or vulnerable would, in her mind, rob them of that escape. She wanted to be remembered as strong and full of life, not as a symbol of decline. Friends who were close to her during these years often described her as stubborn. They tried to encourage her to talk openly about her health, especially as awareness about smoking-related illnesses began to grow. But Lucille refused. She didn't want to be a cautionary tale. She wanted to be remembered for her art, her laughter, and her contributions to television history. By the late 1980s, her health problems had become too severe to ignore. She was hospitalized multiple times for heart-related issues, though much of this was kept quiet from the public. News outlets occasionally reported that she was resting or recovering, but the true seriousness of her condition was rarely acknowledged. This secrecy wasn't just media control, it was Lucille's explicit wish. Even when she did allow herself to be photographed or interviewed, she projected an air of positivity. She wore bright colors, gave witty answers, and pretended everything was fine. Inside, though, she knew time was running out. Her decision to hide her illness was also tied to her legacy. Lucille had worked tirelessly to establish herself as one of the most important figures in entertainment. She was the first woman to run a major television studio. She had created iconic shows, and she had inspired generations of comedians. She didn't want that legacy overshadowed by headlines about her failing health. So she carried on, quietly battling the effects of decades of smoking and stress, while putting on a brave front for the cameras. It was a role she had played her whole life, not just Lucy Ricardo, the housewife with big dreams, but Lucille Ball, the performer who never let the audience see her cry. In her final years, she often retreated to private life with her second husband, Gary Morton. Away from the spotlight, she allowed herself moments of vulnerability, but even then, she avoided talking too openly about her illness. To her closest friends, she would admit feeling tired, but she rarely discussed details. It was almost as if acknowledging it would make it more real, something she couldn't bear. Lucille's silence about her health left many fans completely unprepared for what happened next. When the news of her hospitalization in 1989 spread, the world was shocked. And when she passed away shortly after, it felt sudden. Not because she hadn't been sick, but because she had hidden it so well. The truth was that Lucille Ball had been battling illness for years, but she never wanted the world to know. Because for Lucille, the show always had to go on. Her decision to hide her illness, then, was entirely in character. Lucille Ball had always believed that her job was to make others laugh, to lift them up. Admitting her illness would have turned her into a figure of pity, something she could never accept. She wanted to be remembered as vibrant, funny, and full of life. And in many ways, she succeeded. Today, more than 3 decades after her death, Lucille Ball's legacy is as strong as ever. I Love Lucy continues to air in syndication. Streaming platforms introduce her to new generations, and her influence on comedy, especially for women, remains unmatched. Every comedian who has broken barriers since owes a debt to Lucy. Her life was filled with triumph and tragedy, joy and pain, but her choice to hide her illness revealed something profound about who she was. Lucille Ball wasn't just afraid of death, she was afraid of disappointing her fans. She wanted their last memory of her to be the same as their first. A burst of laughter, a moment of joy, a woman who could make the whole world smile. And so, even in her final act, Lucille Ball was true to her character. The curtain closed not with tears, but with laughter echoing in the hearts of millions. Because for Lucy, the show always had to go on.